Class, this is your Professor Clinton here. I'm aware that several of you, maybe many of you, have had trouble with the coding assignment this week. So I wanted to put together this video to walk you through that. Let's go ahead and download the project that they have pre-created for you. So it's going to be this one called Basic List View Control. And while you're doing that, I want you to verify that you have already installed Eclipse or are using the Aporto Online virtual machine. So once you've done that, you go to your downloads folder and you'll find the zip file that we need. We're going to open that with the archive utility on a Mac. On a Windows, it should just be extract files. And then I'm actually going to move that over to a project folder here. Paste that in there. And being that I've downloaded it several times already, it actually added a number here. So when you're done, you should basically have a folder called Basic List View Control. Inside that folder is the source code, and it should already be configured as an Eclipse project. So as I mentioned, make sure you've got Eclipse installed or are using the online virtual machine provided by Southern New Hampshire. In my case, I went ahead and installed Eclipse, so I'm going to fire that up. Now, once Eclipse opens, it doesn't really matter where you put the workspace, so you can leave that as default or choose where you want to stay. So your Eclipse should look very similar to mine now that I've cleared that out. And what we want to do is actually import projects. Because as I mentioned, the file that you extracted is already an Eclipse project, so it's got Eclipse project metadata in there. And so we need to go find that. When your import dialog appears, you want to choose General, go down to Existing Projects into Workspace, and then we're going to Browse and go to the location you extracted those files to. In my case, it was under the folder I called Projects. And I'm going to select Basic List View Control and choose Open. And you can see that Eclipse did identify this as an Eclipse project. So we can go ahead and hit Finish. Alright, now we want to make sure that this project runs. So we're going to actually go up to Run Configurations, and I want to create a new run configuration. So hit the little plus sign up here, and we want to choose the main class. In this case, it's a top 5 destinations list. Okay, so that's going to be the main class, and we can just call this Basic List View Control. Choose Run, and if all goes well, we should see the window pop up. Okay, and there's the pre-built project. So our task now is to do a couple of things. One, we need to actually change these images to be pictures of vacation locations that you choose. So you just need to choose 5 different vacation package types. So they could be the beach, the Caribbean, the Grand Canyon, wherever you want to go. And then you need to update the title and description to match. And you need to make it so that when the user clicks on one of these, it actually opens up their default browser as it's set on their operating system. So on Windows it might be Edge, on Mac it might be Safari, whatever. Their default browser, and open up a link that takes them to a website about the vacation package you chose for each item. So let's get started on that. One thing I want to point out to you, in Java you've got what's called a resources folder. And this is a place where you can put any files that you want to be bundled directly into the compiled jar file. So in our case, we're going to stick all our pictures in here. And then the default package is where your actual source code goes. So if we open up this Java file, you'll see that there's already quite a bit of source code there. And our task is to modify this code, add some pictures, and update the descriptions. So I'm going to point out a few things to you. At the top of the file, there's what's called a main method. That's the entry point for the program. This is where everything kicks off, and as you can see, we're using Swing Utilities to actually spawn a new thread that we run the graphical user interface on. And what we do in that point is we create a new top destination list frame, which is the Java class that represents the actual window we see. And then we set the title, and we call set visible to true, which is what actually shows the window. So this is where the application gets started. Down here in the top destinations list frame is where we build the actual window the way we want it to look. And here's a very important point. You can see this method, add destination name and picture, is a utility method that is being used to actually add list items to that list in the window. And you can see at this moment it takes two arguments, all right, or two parameters. The first is the text for the list item, and the second is the image. So we can go down and look at this utility method, and you'll see that again here are the two parameters, text and icon. And it uses those to create a data transfer object, or a DTO, a model if you will, that stores that information. So that the sole purpose of this text and icon class is to store those two pieces of data. That's all it does. And then we add that object we created, the text and icon object, to the list model. And the list model is basically a collection, or a bag if you will, of stuff that the list uses to build its items when that it shows to the user. So we are calling this utility method. It takes two parameters, text and icon. It packs those into a text and icon object, and it adds that object to the list that you see when we ran the application. Now, the reason I went through that is the core of our work that we're going to do is we're going to add another field to this text and icon data transfer object, or just basically a box that we stick stuff in, and each of these is linked directly to a list item. So if we want the user to click on a list item and that list item to open a URL in the browser, we need that list item to know what URL is associated with it. What that means is we need to add another field to this text and icon class so we can tell the list item that URL. So let's do that. We're going to add another privately scoped field, and it is a string data type, in other words just text, and it's a URL. Now the constructor is where it's the method that we call to create a new text and icon. So it also needs to accept that URL, and then it needs to set his private field to whatever is passed in through this argument. And then finally we need to give access to other parts of the source code so that they can access that URL we set. Alright, so that's why we're creating what is called an accessor method, or a getter. And we won't be using this, but just to be consistent, let's go ahead and add the mutator method, or the setter, that actually sets that URL. Alright, so we've modified our text and icon data transfer object. Now, the next step is to make this utility method accept a new argument. Okay, so we're going to do that. So he needs to be able to accept the URL, and then he needs to pass that to the text and icon data model. And then finally, you'll notice that all 5 of our calls to that utility method are in error because they're now expecting a third parameter. So just to get this, just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use a few different search engines. So we'll go with Google, and then we can let's say personal favorite DuckDuckGo, and maybe Bing. Okay, and then I don't know, let's stick Twitter in here, and Facebook. So there we go. Not search engines, but they'll do for demonstration purposes. Alright, so now all 5 of our calls are happy. They've got 3 arguments passed in. We're storing those in the data transfer object, which backs the list. So let's go ahead and run this code just to make sure we didn't break anything. Now note that we haven't done anything to make the list open a browser yet, so It really won't be changed at this point. But we just want to make sure, you know, sort of like test-driven development, we want to test it and make sure we haven't broke it. So everything still works. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll change the text here. So first one was Google. The second was DuckDuckGo. The third was Bing. And then Twitter. And then Facebook. Alright, so let's save that. And again, let's run it to make sure everything's still good. Okay, we're good. You see that our text changes are now reflected in the application. And let's say we want to go ahead and change a picture too, just so I can demonstrate that to you. So I did download a image. Let's see. So let me go find an image real quick. So let's search Google icon. Alright, we get something that's not totally huge, so I'm going to go to small. Alright, that's a nice looking icon. So let's save that. We'll save that image. And we're going to save it to the project folder we created. So for me, that was in Projects, Basic List View Control. And now inside your project folder, these are the files you extracted. You're going to notice there is a source folder. Okay, so we want to open that, and inside of there's the Java file. We want to put our picture in the resources folder. And I'm just going to name it Google. I'm going to save it there. We're going back to Eclipse. Now we need to refresh this. So right click on resources and choose refresh. And that tells Eclipse to rescan that folder. Now it knows there's a picture there. So Eclipse will compile that picture into the application. At this point, we can go ahead and update the Google list item by changing the file name to google.png. Okay, now let's run our application and see if we see the changes we're expecting. And there it is. So we've got the new picture. Alright, now we add the last part of this assignment, which is actually opening the web browser. So what we're going to do is we're going to tie into an event emitted by the list in the JList. So let me open this back up and explain how this works. In GUI-based programming and in the web development, you've got what are called events that are emitted by any action the user takes and by other things as well, but you're normally interested in the ones the user causes. So each time I click on this, there are several events taking place. A couple of notable ones are, one, the mouse click that actually emits an event, and when we change the selection of the list, that also emits an event. And what I mean by emitting an event is the list calls any methods that are registered as listeners to that selection changed event. So those methods get executed, and the list also passes them information about the event. So for example, what item was clicked, what element on the actual screen emitted that event, and other things like that. And I don't know all of the different data elements offhand, but just know that when you click on this or interact with the GUI, it emits an event, which means it calls methods that are registered as listeners, event listeners, and that way the programmer can tie into what's going on in the GUI and make things happen in response to the user's actions. And that's what we're going to do. Now, if you want to get really technical and go read the original text on this, I encourage you to check out the Ganga 5 Design Patterns book. I'll show that to you real quick. Ganga 4 Design Patterns book. Okay. This is one that I suggest every programmer have on their bookshelf, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. And in this book, they actually describe what is known as the observer pattern, and that is what is normally used in GUI programming. Okay, so, alright, now back to the example. So what we're going to do is we're going to say list. So remember, that's the JList right here. We're going to do dot add list selection listener. So we're adding a list selection listener, which is a method that gets executed whenever the GUI emits a list selection event. Okay, and that is normally in response to the user changing what is selected in that list. So I'm going to use what is called, excuse me, I didn't mean to scroll down the bottom. I'm going to use what's called a lambda expression. So a lambda expression is basically a shorthand for creating a function, and in this case we're going to accept the event object, which is that data object I was telling you about that has different information about the event. So in this case it's called a list selection event. Alright, so what we want to do at this point is we need to find out which of our text and icon objects correspond to the newly selected element in the JList. And so a real simple way to do that is we're going to go ahead and declare a new text and icon variable to store our reference to that selected object. And I'll call it the selected model. So that's what it is, a selected data model that corresponds to the element in the list that the user clicked on. And we have to cast, all right. And the reason for that is when we ask the list to get his selected value, you can see that the list doesn't care what the actual type is. It's just any object. All right, but we know because we built the list that it is a text and icon object that represents the value of each item in the list, so we can safely cast that unknown object to a specific type. Now with that done, we can go down to the next line and use the Java AWT library's desktop class to get the desktop, which is a object that has information about the user's actual operating system. And in this case we want to call the browse method so that it will open the URL in the default browser. The browse method expects a URI object. URI is a superclass of URLs. In other words, a URL is a kind of URI. And that URI expects a string, so the path. And in this case, we can get that from the selected model we just created the variable for up here. Okay. And then we want to get the URL. Alright, so now you're going to get a little error here, and that's because when creating a URI it can throw exceptions, and so we need to surround it with a try multi-catch. So you can see there will be a URI exception and also an IO exception, can both be generated from the URI. Alright, and so at this point our task is complete, all the technical parts. Now for you still need to go find 5 different vacation packages as described in the user story. You need to update the images to match those like I showed you, and the URLs. But let's go ahead and see if this works. So let's run it. And what we expect to happen is if I click on Google, it's going to open Google in my default browser. Alright, so there's another Google tab. Let's try DuckDuckGo. Oh, there's DuckDuckGo. We can try Bing. There's Bing. You can see everything's working well. Now, one thing you might have noticed is when I clicked on it, it actually opened 2, and there's a reason for that. The add list selection listener has kind of a preset and post-set phase to it. So what we want to do is surround our call with a check. Okay, we're going to check if the value is adjusting. So we can say evt.getValue is adjusting, and we want to only run this. Sorry about that. So we want to only run this block of code after the value has adjusted. In other words, the value is no longer adjusting. So it goes through 2 phases. When you make a selection, it adjusts the value and it calls this listener, and then when it's done adjusting the value is settled, so to speak, and then it calls it again. So by surrounding this with a test, it will only execute our code once and only open the URL once. So let's run that one more time and see if we fix the issue. Alright, so I'm going to click Google. Look at there, only 1 tab. DuckDuckGo, 1 tab. Bing, 1 tab. That's what we were expecting. Alright, so I've walked you through how to code this. I've explained the concepts to you. We did a little debugging together. I hope this video helped. I'd appreciate any feedback you guys have. If you have any trouble following this or any more questions, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you in the discussion room, or we can schedule a video call. With that said, have a great evening, and thank you.